farther along. Good morning. Welcome to our morning service. Good to see you this morning. We're going to start by singing the song Farther Along. Tempted and tried, we're off made to wonder. Sing it with me this morning. Here we go. Tempted and tried, we're off made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long, while there are others living about us, never molested, though in the wrong. Sing it out now. Farther along, we'll know more about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. Often when death has taken our loved ones, leaving our home so lone and so drear, then do we wonder why others prosper, living so wicked year after year. We'll understand it one day. Farther along, we'll know more about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. On that last, soon we will see our dear loving Savior. Hear the last trumpet sound through the sky. Then we will meet those gone on before us. Then we shall know and understand why. Farther along, we'll know more about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. Amen. Now we're going to sing Trust and Obey. When we walk with the Lord in the light of His Word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Sing it with me this morning. When we walk with the Lord in the light of His Word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Verse number 2. Not a shadow can rise, not a cloud in the skies, but His smile quickly drives it away. Not a doubt or a fear, not a sigh or a tear can abide while we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other you so much. You did a good job. Psalm chapter 78. Psalm chapter 78. So for some of you and me, we may have to think back a little bit for this question. Let's take a moment to think back to our school days. Back to high school, maybe back to junior high, back to elementary school. Did you have a favorite subject? Anyone have a favorite subject? How about a favorite teacher? Is there a teacher you can remember? Let me ask you this question. Is it possible that that subject and that teacher match up? In other words, you had such a good teacher in that subject that that's the reason why you like that class or subject. Quite often, that's what happens to us. I think that's one of the reasons that my second most unfavorite subject was history. Now, that may be one of your favorites, but when I went to school, my first most unfavorite, or my most unfavorite of all subject, was math. You've heard me say before, there were times that, I would study for every class. I would do the best I can. Whenever it came to math, I would study hard. A lot of my other courses, even in high school, I could get A's or B's, and it wasn't too difficult for me. But math, I would study and study and study, and sometimes my best was a C. Sometimes it might have been even a little bit lower than that. Just something about math, I just wasn't super great at it. I didn't enjoy it all that much. My brother was different. My brother was the mathematician. Math was not my favorite, but why was history a not-so-favorite subject? Usually because I had teachers who were very educated. They knew all the dates. They knew all the geography. They knew all the places. But when they stood up there and they talked about those things, it sounded like they were like one note. It just kind of drifted away. It didn't seem like history really mattered to me. It didn't seem like they got on fire about anything. It didn't seem like they were enjoying what they're talking about. It's just like, memorize these dates, memorize these places. You need to know it. History's good. And that's what I got out of it was, there's no need to study history. Something turned around, though. I went to college, and I know this is going to sound crazy, but I was like, okay, trying to figure out what does God want to do with my life. I know he's probably called me to preach or pastor one day, but what does that look like? Well, I did like a lot of young people do. You start, right, in college by picking something you think is the right thing, and then you may change your mind along the way. It's kind of what happened to me. You know, I was able, because I was an introvert, I didn't feel like I could ever preach to adults, and I could get along with teenagers and children because I was a teenager. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'm going to work with children. And then I thought, would it be nice to travel the world? Would it be nice to travel the country? So I thought, who gets to travel the country? Evangelists, right? Evangelists were popular at that time. You go from state to state and you preach. And I thought, I wonder if I could be a child evangelist. I wonder if I could go around from church to church around the country and do something to get the attention of the kids and preach the gospel to them. So in my mind, I kind of thought about that. But then when I get to college, they let me know and they say, hey, it's a hard time to get a job as just a pastor these days. Usually if you want to pastor, they usually have a Christian school too. So you want to have an education background. And so they had a degree that was pastoral assistant, which means you could be a pastor, concentration education, which means you could work in education. Then I had to pick what kind of education. Well, I like children. Couldn't imagine myself, because I was a teenager, teaching teenagers. And I definitely didn't think I would pastor adults one day. And so I thought, hey, I'll do elementary education. But I've got to be honest with you. Mom, close your ears. Don't listen. Gotta be honest with you, there was another reason I picked elementary education. Because I got inside their book and looked at every course that you had to take for upper school education and elementary education. And you know what it said for elementary education? That all of the math courses that I needed, if I took one test and passed it, I didn't have to take math in college. And I knew if I studied hard enough, I could probably pass that one test, and I did. So I didn't have one single math course in college. I was a happy camper. But guess what I was required to take? My second most unfavorite, history. And so I signed up, I think it was second or third semester. I waited a while because I didn't want a history class. I waited, and I think it was my second year. I had, it was like a world history class. It was a history of different civilizations. And I thought, oh boy, this is really going to be, but I got to do it. I've got to get this degree. So I take the class. And I can tell you, I completely changed my mind about history because of my professor. His name was Dr. Mark Rasmussen. And boy, did he make history come to life. It was like, I don't know how to explain it other than if you remember listening to the old-time radio shows before TV, or if you remember hearing them, you know, even after you had a TV, and you could just sit and listen to radio, and they dramatized it and told the story where it made it come to life, and you could like picture everything happening in your mind, even though you didn't have it in front of you on a TV. That's the way he taught history. He took you back in time. He transported you. He told you stories. He made you smell what things smelled like by the way he talked. You could taste the food. You could almost imagine what the people looked like. You can imagine how their interactions were like. And one of the things he was good about was saying, this is what happened then, but this is how it could relate to you today. In other words, we're not just learning history to learn history, but these people did some good things, and we could learn from the good, and they did some awful things. And we need to take heed and learn from those awful things that they did to not do them ourselves. And would you agree with me that some of our biggest problems in the world and in America wouldn't have to be so bad if we had just learned from other people's past mistakes? If we just looked back and said, oh, do you remember when the country did this and then this happened? Then why are we doing that again? Why do we keep going back and making the same mistakes after mistakes? Because we're not learning the importance of history. To look back and say, okay, this is what they did was right and it worked. So if we do the same thing, guess what? It'll probably work. And if they messed up by doing such and such and we do the same thing, it's probably going to end up with the same mess today. But we're hard-headed. We're human beings who think that we've got the right answers, that we can figure it all out on our own, and we don't need God and we don't need history. But that's not the case. Well, Pastor Steve, why do you bring that up at the beginning of this psalm? Because what we're going to find here is this. We're going to find a psalm that was written to wake people up and say, there's a history here. Pay attention to it. This is what you need to do with those things that you learned from the past, and here's what you're supposed to do with them today. The idea of learning from others past mistakes, being scholars of history and its lessons, being better people because of it. Somehow we miss it. And that's what's behind this psalm, Psalm chapter 78. This psalm is titled, A Contemplation of Asaph. So let's first take the idea of a contemplation. You know what that means, right? To contemplate, to think deeply about. At some point in Asaph's life, he said, here are things I've been deeply thinking about. They are heavy on my heart, and I want to share them with you. Asaph was a great singer and musician from David and Solomon's time. He's known as a musical composition prophet. That's pretty deep there, huh? He could write and compose music, but he was also a prophet. Psalm 78 is the longest of the historical Psalms. It's long. And so this contemplation that he's having, because it's so long, there must be a lesson in it. There must be a reason that it's quite long. I believe there's two different reasons. Number one, he wanted to get his point across. Number two, he wanted to make sure people got it, that they didn't ignore their history, that they learned from history. He wanted them to understand that history does not have to repeat itself. Bad history and good history can be repeated if you take and use the same formulas. And he wanted to teach them that the people of God needed to trust and obey, not try to figure out things by their own devices. So we begin with verses 1 through 4. Verses 1 through 4 is Asaph beginning with a reminder that we must learn from the past. We must learn from the past. But not only that, don't miss this. This is important to everyone that's in this room and everyone that's watching. Not only should we learn from our past and the past before us, but we need to teach the future. Don't miss that. Not only are we just supposed to learn about it ourselves, but we're supposed to teach those who are coming behind us. That's the reason, and we're going to be talking about this quite often today, that's the reason it's important, grandpa and grandmas. That's the reason it's important, those of you who are older in the church, to stay in the church even as the church gets young, and to be involved in the church, and to share your stories, and stories from the past, and stories from history. You know, there are a lot of young people, there are some people even my age, who have not experienced a major war. My mom tells stories about being in West Virginia and about the air raid sirens and about them having to hide in West Virginia, in America, during the war in case they were to get bombed. I've not experienced that. That's a completely different type of world. It could be that it happens again one day. But how are our young people going to know how to react? Are they going to be prepared for it? Are we telling them the stories? Are we teaching them from others' past mistakes? This is what we need to understand, and this is what he's trying to get across here, that we need to learn from the past, but we also need to teach the future generations. Beginning of verse 1 of Psalm 78. Give ear, O my people. You know what that means, right? Listen up. Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable, a story. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. Notice different things. He's letting us know this is about history. Those things that we've heard and known, but also not the things that just we've heard and known, but the stories that our fathers told us. Those things that are written in the history books. We need to know that all these things are important. Verse 4, why? We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wondrous works that he hath done. That's what's all behind it. He's saying history is important. It's important for us to share our stories about our life and what we've been through and what we've seen. It's important for us to share our parents' and our grandparents' stories, because this new generation needs to see that the answer isn't through politics, the answer isn't through government, the answer isn't through our own schemes and our own doings, that we've learned the hard way maybe in our grandparents, that these are the lessons that you need to carry forth. These are the things you need to know. You need to understand that God is a good God, and he's the one you need to put your trust in no matter what comes. We must learn from the past and teach the future. So let me ask you this question. What stories are you sharing? How are you doing whenever it comes to finding younger people and sharing their stories? Well, they don't want to hear my stories. Oh, you'd be surprised. Maybe you could cut them down from being like 50 minutes per story to about 10 or 15, because that's about their attention span. But you know what? I love to hear a good story, especially when there's a lesson behind it, especially when it comes from the heart of an older person that says, hey, you know, when I was a kid, such and such, not to be demeaning, because we could do that, can't we? It could be easy. Back when I was a child, I did such and such, and you're no good for nothing. You know, that's what it comes across like, even if we don't mean it. There's a way that we could tell with a compassion in our hearts a story about our lives and those who've gone on before us, because we truly care about them and their future and our grandchildren's future. And we want to point them in the right direction. And we don't want them to make the same mistakes. And so in verses 5 through 8, Asaph now stresses the importance of one generation avoiding the mistakes or errors of another generation. So now he's going to jump in and say, here are some big mistakes that we made. The next generation does not need to make these same mistakes. Listen what he says beginning verse 5. For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they would make them known to their children. Verse 6. That the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. The idea is for us to learn from each other, and not just from our good things, but from our mistakes. Verse 7, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and might not be, here it is, as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. Is Asaph making it clear here? Is he making it clear that history is a good thing and we ought to tell our children and their children and keep the history being passed on, and to let them know, don't be like Grandpa and Grandma was, or don't be like my mom and dad was, or don't be like even I was, or people in my generation was. Don't be stubborn and think you know the way when God's the right way. Hey, son, I had to learn the hard way. Hopefully you don't have to learn it this way. Let me try to teach you this lesson. Hey, I want to pass on to you and let you know some mistakes we made along the way. And our biggest error was us trusting in ourselves rather than trusting and obeying God. We tried to do it on our own. We were stubborn. We were rebellious. And you know where that made me end up? You know how many years of my life I wasted? And it doesn't need to be that way with you. Teach them to your children, he says. Let them know of our mistakes. Verses 5 through 8 stresses the importance of one generation avoiding their errors of another generation. And then, after verse 8, Asaph embarks upon a history lesson of sorts. And we're not going to go through all these verses, but when you get a chance, maybe when you go home tonight, look at the next several verses, like verses 9 through 20. He teaches them a history lesson. He gives examples of the lessons that should be taught and learned from their past. In verses 9 through 11, he talks about how many had lost the spiritual battles they had faced. In verses 12 through 16, he talks about Israel being stubborn and rebellious in their exodus. He tells the Exodus stories and how things could have been much better, but they were stubborn and rebellious. Once again, their sin got in the way. In verses 17 through 20, he continues to talk about their stubbornness and rebellion, even though he says God was doing wondrous works in their midst. Don't miss that. He said, even though God was still up to good, and God held things together, how much better it could have been for them if they wouldn't have continued being stubborn and rebellious, and they missed the good that was going on. What were they teaching? They were teaching that as human beings, we have a problem. We're selfish, we try to be in control, and usually we waste our life. We don't live it for what it should be lived for. Then we look back on our life and we say, man, I was stubborn. Man, I thought I knew the right way. Man, I thought I was taking the right path. Man, I missed the good that God was doing. I was so wrapped up and worried about tomorrow that I missed the today. I was so worried about getting the paycheck and taking care of my family that I was gone from home all the time and I lost my family. You said they would say that to their children and grandchildren. How else would their grandchildren and their children learn? Some of the best lessons that the next generation could learn are from our mistakes. So think about it this way. Hopefully no one in this room is this way, but it's a common thing these days. You know, we have a whole generation. We're good at complaining about the new generation, right? We have this whole generation in America, probably more so than the rest of the world, who's what? Deep into debt. Yeah, they, instead of owing no one anything, they owe everyone something. Our nation is in debt. Everyone thinks that to live the life of an American means you have to have this nice car and this nice house and this nice education, and you have to go to this college, and we make everyone think you're a nobody unless you do these things and you have these things, and so we hold them up to these standards, and by the time a kid is 30 years old, he's already $50,000 to $200,000 in debt. And now he spends the rest of his or her life in debt. So what's wrong with the parents saying, hey, I'm old and I don't have much to leave you because I never learned to save. And I thought I had to have this car and I got myself in debt. And I end up paying 3 times more for that car than what it was really worth. It's better maybe if you save some money and just bought you a used car. And one day, because you use your money wisely and you save, then you could buy the nice car and you won't owe a penny on it and you'll pay what it was actually worth. What? You got to be kidding. But you know what that means? That means some of us who are older humbling ourselves and saying, you know what? I know I'm telling you don't do as I did, but I'm telling you don't do as I did because it sure would have been better if I hadn't made that mistake. Yeah, there's so many things. That's just one example. There's so many things where he's saying they could learn from these things from the past. They miss the good that's going on around them because they worry, and a lot of times they get them in their own themselves in those situations. Do you notice what's clear here from Asaph's psalm? He was teaching the importance of being real with the next generation, not glossing things over, but to tell them of our failures so they will not follow the same path. We are to teach the next generation, get this, about our stubbornness. We're supposed to teach the next generation about our missed opportunities. We're supposed to teach the next generation about our missing God even in the good. And we're supposed to teach the next generation about our failed spiritual battles. You know, after working as a youth pastor for several years, almost 10 years as a junior high youth pastor, almost 5 years as a youth pastor before I went and started a church plant and became a regular pastor. After all those years teaching in a Christian school and being a youth pastor, I could tell you one thing that I know is 100% true in working with young people, and it is this: there's nothing more powerful to a young person than the vulnerability of a parent, a grandparent, someone who is one of their leaders. There's nothing as powerful to a young person as the vulnerability of a person who could admit they are wrong, say they are sorry, be broken about it, and help teach those kids the truth. I promise you, one of the best things you could ever do, even in your old age, if you haven't done it, for your children, for your grandchildren, and to teach your children to do it theirs, is just be honest. And when you mess up, that day that you had a bad day and you scream at them, is to shake it off and come back and in all honesty, with a tear in your eye and with brokenness, say, man, I'm sorry. I should have not reacted that way. I love you so much. I should have never let it get to this place. You're like, what? Yeah, you know what it does in your own life when someone else humbles himself and they're honest with you and they get real and they're vulnerable. It's one of the best ways to teach the next generation. Not a, I'm better than you, and this is how we did it, and this is what you need to get right, or you're going to be a failure, but rather a, hey, I don't want you to mess up. And boy, if I messed up, can I tell you a story? I sure hope you don't get in that situation yourself. And by the way, I know I wasn't the greatest parent. I made some big mistakes, and for that, man, I'm sorry. Here's one of the biggest ones I made with you. It's in this area, and I'm afraid you may be doing it with your own children. That's just being real. That's just being honest. Not always will they take it well, but this is what he's teaching. There's an importance of us understanding that history and mistakes and these things can help another generation if we're just vulnerable and real about these things. We are to teach the next generation about these things. And listen, we share with them our brokenness, our vulnerability, our admitting that we're wrong, our saying sorry, but with brokenness and truth. Yes, truth. Asaph continues in verses 21 through 25 and tells them the truth about God's displeasure, God's anger with the mistrust and unbelief of Israel. He doesn't gloss things over. He lets them know you do things on your own, there will be a judgment. Sin messes you up. You make the wrong decisions, there are going to be consequences. Now, what your child does, you probably maybe had to learn this the hard way. What your child and your grandchildren does, don't think that that's you could teach them and raise them up the best that you can, and they could still make their own decision and blow it. Don't be so offended and hurt by that. Yes, pray for them, but you've got to let them know that they will reap the consequences of their own decisions. We've got to be reminded that one day they are going to stand before God for their own decisions, and they need to understand that. They need to understand that there are consequences for their mistakes. Listen what he tells them, beginning in verse 21. Therefore the Lord heard this, and he was wroth. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also came up against Israel, because they believed not in God and trusted not in his salvation. Though he had commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven and had rained down manna upon them to eat and had given them of the corn of heaven, man did eat angels' food. He sent them meat to the full. You know what he's doing? He's doing a history lesson here. He's saying, hey, Israel, they had it all handed to them. They still missed the goodness of God. It made God angry. I've done this for you, but you've taken advantage of this. And look at the mess you've made for yourself. You know what that reminds me of? Let's be honest. America. Look what you've been given. Look at what you have. And you just take it for granted. And you just want more. And you think you could do it on your own. And you completely leave God out of it all. God is displeased with that. Don't be surprised if there's a judgment and there's consequences to doing it your own way. Asaph was saying, learn from us. Please don't make the same mistakes. And please, 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 please do not miss the good that God has done. Don't miss what life is all about. Don't get to the end and have a whole bunch of things, but all your relationships are broken. Don't get to the end of this life and not know about eternal life and have that right with God. There are things that are more important. And so Asaph continues through several more verses by explaining Israel's sad testimony, their sad story. And then, get this, he adds this in verse 32. This really sums it up. For all this, he means in spite of all of this, they sinned still. They sinned still. Despite everything God had done for them, they sinned still and believed not for his wondrous works. They still sinned. They still didn't see his wondrous works. They missed it. He's saying, learn from history, learn from me, learn from my parents and their mistakes and their parents, learn from the Bible. The Bible is full of stories. Don't miss the Old Testament and throw it out, because the Old Testament is full of what? Full of stories where people thought, I have it all together, and they mess up, and they have to be reminded, come back to God, and they do, and they have it right for a while, then they fall back to doing their own thing and not trusting God, and then they completely mess up the nation all over again, and then God's got to get their attention again, and then they come back, and why is that in there over and over and over and over and over again? Because we're thick-skulled and we never learn. So Asaph is saying, use that to teach. Say, hey, son, daughter, it's a good reason to read the Bible. It's full of a bunch of stories that's teaching the same thing over and over again. A lot of us have really messed it up. Don't you mess it up too. You could have a better future. You could find your purpose here on earth. You could have an eternal home in heaven. You could make a difference while you're here. Don't blow it. Learn from us. That's part of your purpose. That's part of my purpose, to draw their attention to this. And yet, despite all the things God did, he said, they still sinned. And they believed not, even though he had done so many wondrous works around them. In the following verses, Asaph then talks about God's great love. Yeah, he was being truthful. Do you know there's two sides to truth? There's two sides to God. There is the judgment. There is the justice. There is the anger. But why is there justice and anger? Because of his love. Because he really cares. Not because he's the big meanie in the sky. It's because he's actually the God of love. He is love. Because he loves so much, he warns. That's what he's telling us we're supposed to do. If history, we're supposed to warn. We're supposed to let them know this is not the way. And so Asaph wants to make sure that they understand part of this great story is God puts up with us. And he still loves us. And his grace and his mercy is still available. So if you think, I'm too old, I can't fix it now, you still got some years left. You can still live for him, and there's things that you can do. I'm telling you about one of them today. He's saying, don't get so down in the dumps when you have a God who loves you. And if you have 2 weeks, 2 years, 20 years, 50 years left in your life, however much you have left, no matter what you've done in the past and your mess, God's love is there for you. His grace is there for you. His mercy is there for you. And you could get it right from this point on. And you could teach next generations even from your own story and your own mistakes. Listen to what he says. He brings up God's love. That despite all of that they missed, that his love endures. And he is merciful despite our unbelief, our mistrust, and our sin. Verse 38 and 39. But he, God, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and destroyed them not. He could have, but he didn't. Yes, many a time turned he his anger away and did not stir up all his wrath, for he remembered that they were but flesh. Yeah. That means he understands we're not perfect. We're going to mess up. And he gets angry with us because it's not the life he had planned for us. It's not the way he wanted us to live. He didn't want us to live lives of worry and hurt and wandering. He wanted us to be full of joy and hope and peace and to trust in him and obey him. But then we went through life and we missed all those wondrous works, and he said, so at least accept my grace and my mercy now, and now teach these things to other people who maybe they won't waste their life. And then that gives you what? Some of your purpose back. Because I'm not done with you either. Because that same grace and mercy and love is available for you no matter your age, no matter what you've been through, no matter what you've done. And I want to help you through this. I want to teach you through this. And I remember you are but flesh. And I know you need me. I've never left you or forsaken you. Asaph continues on with the history lesson. He talks about Israel's failure to remember the power of God from Egypt to Canaan. That's what he talks about in verses 40 through 55. And then in the next 8 or so verses, he talks about, guess what? Their stubbornness and their rebellion in the promised land. After all God did, he still gave them love and mercy, but then what did they do? They still went and did their own thing. They did their own thing from Egypt to Canaan. They did their own thing and were still stubborn and rebellious in the promised land. And then finally, in verses 67 through 72, he gives them an updated history lesson. He said, I've just walked you through this whole history of Israel and how they were stubborn and how they were rebellious, but God still was there with them, and how you need to learn the lessons from these things so you don't make the same mistake yourself. But I'm going to tell you how God's mercy is here today, and how God's grace is still here today, and how he loves you today, and how the future can be better, because this is what he's doing right now. This is his history lesson. In verses 67 through 72, he ends with the more recent history to show that God was still in control, that he still was their great shepherd, despite what? Whenever we're given examples as followers of Christ and we're called sheep, let's be honest, part of that is what? Are sheep real smart? No. I think there's a reason God uses that illustration. Sheep go astray. They don't know what they're doing. They're kind of messed up. And he's like, that's exactly what he's saying when I say, I remember your flesh. I remember you're a sheep and I'm the great shepherd. I need to guide you, but you need to listen to me. You need to remember, as your great shepherd, I'm trying to guide you the right way. And whenever you think I'm being mean and I'm grabbing you at the crook and I'm yanking you in, it's because you are about to walk off the edge. I'm protecting you as the great shepherd. And so as the great shepherd, I'm letting you know I am here with you today. And I am regularly trying to keep you from going astray. But he goes on with the current history lesson and says this, and God is now providing you an earthly shepherd in King David to help guide you in the right way. He's saying, here's where we are in our history lesson. It's ended to today. And I can tell you what he's doing today. He's still the great shepherd. He still cares. He wants you to go along the right path. He wants you to guide you. He wants you to lay down in green pastures. He wants you to trust and obey. He wants you to live that life of joy and hope. And in order to do that, one of the ways he's done it is give you the king who he gave you today. And he didn't choose just anyone. He chose a shepherd because he knew that's exactly what you needed. You needed someone help guide you in the right way. This is what he says in verses 70 through 72. He chose David, also his servant, and took him from what? The sheepfolds. From following the ewes, great with young, he brought him to feed Jacob his people and Israel his inheritance. Don't miss how he's saying, God, took a shepherd boy for a reason. Because he knew that where you are today, you need to be shepherded. You need to be guided. You need to be scolded. You need to be warned. You need to be helped along the way. Verse 72, so he fed them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. You know what he's saying in a sense? I still provide. I still love you. I'm still in control. If you look around you, I'm still doing good. I think that's what we need in this world today, right? This world that we're in today, you watch the news lately? Do you need to be reminded that God's still in control? I know I do. Because it can get so easily wrapped up to just say, whew, man, I hope he comes back soon. Well, I agree with you. It sure looks like that's the mess that we're in, and he needs to come back soon, right? But you know what? We could go through each day saying, whew, I wish he could get back soon. And we could miss doing what we're supposed to be doing today and saying, hey, young people, let me tell you a story. Let me teach you the right way. Let me remind you that no matter how many years you have left, you need to live it for him. Here's the reason why. That's the opportunity that we have. God hasn't forgotten you. He's still in charge. His love, his mercy, and his grace is still there. You can still come to him. So share your story. Share the history. Be honest with people. Find ways that you can point people in the right direction by lovingly, with a heart, with a shepherd's heart, letting others know Here's my story. You know, I'll never forget whenever I finally got that teacher of history, the professor in college. Why it never dawned on me before that. I'd even been in a Christian school. And I remember one of his first lessons where he taught, notice in the word history, that part of the name history is the word story. He said there's a whole bunch of stories have gone on. We need to learn from those stories. But ultimately, we need to remember that God is in control. It's his story, his story. And I know you probably never heard that. That probably wasn't your first time. But when he said that, I was like, oh, his story, my story, his story. I get it. It's important for us to share stories. So much that whenever I had the opportunity to do my one and only church plant, unless God allows me to do it one day in the future, whenever we planted our church in Joliet, Illinois, I was like, I want to make sure we pick the right name for our church. And man, I struggled with it. I got to be honest with you, part of me was like, I got to find a cool, unique name, because that's just what church planners were doing, okay? Let's find a unique name that makes someone go, I wonder what that is. And a lot of them were using Greek and Hebrew words. And I was like, I wonder if there's a Greek or Hebrew word that could get across what I wanted. And what I wanted was to have a church the way I thought Jesus would do church in Joliet, Illinois, and to love everybody in their story and to try to bring their story in tune with his story, to allow them to see that everyone's story matters. And so I looked up what's the Greek or Hebrew or Latin word for story, and I found it, and my church's name became Istoria, I-S-T-O-R-I-A, Istoria Church, Story Church. It's all about your story, his story, meeting up, finding your purpose in him. What's your story today? What's your story? It's not over. You're still writing it, and you have the opportunity to share it with someone along the way. Who are you sharing it with? Who are you encouraging? Who are you helping along their way? Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much for this wonderful lesson from Psalm chapter 78. God, I ask that you would allow us to take our stories and to share them with other people, that they might benefit. Help us be vulnerable and help us be honest about those things that we made mistakes on. Help us be honest with people around us and say, hey, I hope you learn from me and learn from others and you don't make the same mistakes. And that's part of our purpose here on earth, is relationship, loving one another, fellowship. That's what church is all about. Help us be more involved than we were ever before, especially with the next generation, so that they're prepared for whatever it is they may face. And I'm afraid maybe a lot worse than many of us have ever faced. And so we got to do our job in preparing them. That means we can't think our life is already over. We can't live our lives full of worry and pain and hurt and sitting and doing nothing. Our life could still make the difference for future generations. We just got to figure out how we need to do that. We thank you for this help.